Most public use airports have adequate margins of safety built into the airport design in terms of runway length and obstructions. But at some point, pilot sloppiness, plane limitations, and environmental conditions can combine in bad ways. Then you have dinged props, bent metal, or worse. So the bottom line, when you use the POH numbers to determine takeoff and landing performance, add a safety margin to the distances. The Air Safety Foundation recommends adding 50% of the book takeoff and landing distance to estimate how much runway you'll need. Here's an important statistic. There are about 50% more landing accidents than takeoff accidents. But takeoff accidents are more than 4 times as likely to result in fatalities. Takeoff combines high power and slow speed, a recipe for disaster if the aircraft is allowed to stall or control is lost. Pilots must be aware that power loss is a possibility on every takeoff. If the engine quits on a single-engine airplane, the pilot must quickly transition to a glide, maintain control, and fly the airplane all the way to the ground. An engine failure on a multi-engine airplane requires the pilot to maintain control, determine if a climb and return to the airport is possible, and if not, land the airplane off airport. In some ways, takeoffs are the most demanding operations for a general aviation pilot. Think about it. How long has it been since you last flew? Takeoff is one of the highest workload phases of flight. Checklists, ATC clearance, taxi instructions, aircraft configuration, and then the takeoff, managing power, airspeed, course, and attitude, while dealing with sometimes hostile atmospheric conditions, collision avoidance, and ATC instructions. And we may not have had our hands on an airplane in weeks. This is certainly one factor behind many takeoff accidents. Pilots can set themselves up for takeoff accidents before they even get to the runway. Improper configuration is another common factor cited in accident reports. Make sure flaps are set properly and the trim is adjusted correctly. If either is set incorrectly, you'll have a less than booked performance takeoff, or worse. You're cleared to taxi into position and hold. Wait a second. Have you visually cleared the area? Even at towered airports, you need to check. Pilots have died from failing to follow this simple rule. Look for planes on short final and others that may have taken the active at intersections ahead of you or behind you. While we're on the subject of intersections, unless there is much more runway than you'll need, ASF recommends against intersection takeoffs. Remember, as a taxpayer, you're entitled to use all the runway. In the event of an emergency, that extra 1,000 or 2,000 feet could make the difference between a non-event and an accident. Okay, you've been cleared for departure. This is the germinating point for the #1 cause of takeoff accidents: loss of control. Loss of control accounts for almost 1/3 of these mishaps. This is what sends airplanes off the side of the runway. The rudder is the most critical element in maintaining directional control. Maybe you've got 2 left feet on the dance floor, but you'll need to know how to dance on the rudder pedals. Some pilots have never been taught, and others have forgotten. Of course, the ailerons have to be positioned relative to the wind, but there's not even a breeze today, remember? If you have a steerable nose or tail wheel, it's best to stay off the brakes until you need them to slow down. If you ride too high on the pedals, you may get braking action when you don't need it. That can result in lengthening the takeoff roll or destroying a tire on landing. Right rudder counteracts the torque, P-factor, and slipstream effect that together tend to yaw the airplane to the left during takeoff and climb. Unless you're flying a twin with counter-rotating props, you'll need a strong but sensitive right foot on takeoff to keep the airplane going straight. Keep your eyes outside the airplane. We'll never know how many of those loss of control accidents resulted from the pilot being distracted and focusing on something inside the cockpit. Where should you be looking? Not at the center line. You should be looking past the end of the runway to a reference point, a line of trees, say, or whatever's beyond the end of the runway you can aim for. How do you know when to rotate? Again, you'll find the numbers in your POH, but that's not the final answer. First of all, you shouldn't be staring at your airspeed indicator, waiting for a magic number to haul back on the yoke. You have to have a feel for the rotation speed. This is the art of flying. The airspeed indicator will give you a rough idea when you're reaching it. Your airplane will communicate more precisely, but you have to be attuned to get the message. It will feel light and ready to fly. At rotation speed, just enough back pressure is applied to let the plane fly itself off the runway. Some pilots try to peel the airplane off the ground with excessive and premature back pressure. This increases drag, lengthens the takeoff roll, and may result in a stall. Some leave it on the runway too long. This leads to jarring takeoff rolls, nose wheel shimmy, and worn tires. What's the proper pitch for climb out? Between 5 and 10 degrees off the horizon will yield a healthy positive rate. That's between the first and second horizontal bar over the horizon on the attitude indicator, but your main reference is outside. You should have a mental picture of where that puts the cowl of your aircraft relative to the horizon. Up to now, we've assumed everything's going according to plan. But what if you're almost at rotation speed when the engine starts making a not-so-funny sound, or the oil pressure annunciator lights up, or some other situation tells you to reject the takeoff? How much pavement do you need to stop? Singles and many light twins don't publish stopping distances, but you can make reasonable estimates from the landing rollout numbers. Assuming you had to reject the takeoff at rotation speed and you have to plan for the worst case without aggressive braking action, the stopping distance would be a little less than the landing rollout because you'll be rotating at a slightly lower speed than you'd be landing. To be safe, use the published landing distance to estimate how much runway you'll need. Rejected takeoffs are another leading accident factor. If you have to apply heavy braking, don't let one foot overpower the other. Otherwise, you'll likely wind up going off the side of the runway, which doesn't help when you're trying to avoid going off the end of it. And make sure your feet are actually on the brakes. On some aircraft, the rudder and brake pedals are suspended from a torque tube. Riding too high on the pedals will result in pushing on the torque tube, not the brakes. Make sure you know where to position your feet for the most effective braking action on your machine. But everything's going smoothly today. Positive climb rate has been established, gear and flaps retracted. Time for the old climb-out debate. Do you climb at VX, best climb angle, and try to gain altitude while close to the airport, or do you climb at VY, best rate of climb, a speed that's more efficient and allows greater visibility over the nose? Here's where art comes to the rescue of science. Each departure and climb-out has to be planned for the conditions that exist at that time, at that airport, and at that runway. However, the Air Safety Foundation advocates using VX, or best climb angle, only to avoid obstacles on takeoff. VY should be used after obstacles are cleared until a comfortable maneuvering altitude, 1,500 to 2,000 feet AGL, is reached. After that, a cruise climb speed slightly higher than VY will provide better forward visibility and engine cooling. Those are the basics of the normal takeoff. We'll come back into the pattern for a normal landing. Many airports have visual indicators such as VASIs or PAPIs that tell you if you're high, low, or in the slot on your way to a perfect landing. Some runways are served by instrument landing systems, or ILSs. These approach aids also provide glide slope information. Let's head back into the pattern and talk about other factors that play a role in normal landing. It doesn't get much easier than this. A long, wide runway and no wind. But, as in takeoffs, most landing accidents happen without any help from adverse conditions. Runway conditions, required and available length, and off-field landing spots all have to be considered in preparation for landing, just as they do in the normal takeoff. Be aware of any anomalies in the runway, like poor braking action and rough spots. Failure to set flaps and trim correctly also takes a high toll, as they do on takeoff. Improper configuration is the fifth leading cause of landing accidents. Flaps help slow you down, lower the stall speed, and also allow you to make a steeper approach, giving you more altitude and a better view ahead. So be sure to crank them in, gang. The plane should be trimmed back to at least takeoff position. The Air Safety Foundation and FAA recommend a stabilized approach. Now, it's called stabilized because power is basically static, yielding the proper airspeed and descent rate.